Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human research and written material.
Right.
So we usually think of healing as, an instant fix. Like, you have an infection, you take some antibiotics, the fever breaks, and you are just better.
Yeah, it's very clean.
Exactly. It's binary. You're sick and then you're healthy. Blind, then seeing. But, what if the cure to your deepest, most profound blindness actually makes your reality blurrier, like more disorienting, and frankly, far more terrifying before it ever makes things clear?
I mean, that completely upends our expectation of the quick fix, right?
Yeah.
We all want that sudden epiphany where the clouds part and our entire life just makes perfect sense.
Oh, for sure. We love an overnight success story.
Right, but when you step into the world of deep psychological and spiritual development, the diagnostic landscape is incredibly murky.
Yeah.
The transition from being totally oblivious to truly understanding your reality is almost never a lightning bolt. It is usually a painful, stumbling process of your eyes slowly adjusting to a light you aren't entirely sure you even want to see.
And that painful adjustment is exactly the terrain we are exploring today. We're taking a massive, really immersive deep dive into one of the most intense, relentless sections of ancient biographical literature.
The Gospel of Mark.
Yes, the central narrative arc of Mark. Specifically, we're looking at the text spanning from a very strange healing in a town called Bethsaida all the way down the road to Jerusalem, chapter 8, verse 22, right through the end of chapter 10.
That's a huge section.
It is, but our mission today is to examine what happens when our deeply held, often completely unconscious assumptions about power, wealth, comfort, and success are just violently dismantled.
Well, the architecture of this narrative is absolutely brilliant because it uses physical sight as this relentless physical metaphor for psychological and spiritual comprehension.
Like seeing versus understanding.
Exactly. The author essentially maps out the human ego's desperate fight for survival. We're going to look at a group of people, the disciples, who have front row seats to ultimate truth, yet they constantly fight against it.
Because it threatens their status?
Right, because it challenges everything they thought they wanted. It is a masterclass in reevaluating what it means to be a fully realized human being.
Let's start with that initial, really disorienting moment of healing. So Jesus and his disciples arrive at Bethsaida. A blind man is brought to him, and the crowd is begging for a miraculous touch.
Right, they want to show.
Yeah, they want the spectacle. But instead of performing an instantaneous, crowd-pleasing miracle, Jesus takes this blind man by the hand and physically leads him entirely out of the village. He completely removes him from his environment. I mean, why this sudden field trip?
You really have to look at the broader pattern of how truth operates in these texts. Removing the man from the village is highly intentional. First, there is just the immediate necessity of removing the spectacle.
To avoid the crowds.
Right. Operating in front of an audience that just wants a magic trick transforms a profound moment of personal restoration into cheap entertainment. But there is a deeper, more sobering reason grounded in the historical context of that specific town.
Bethsaida. Yeah.
Yes. Bethsaida was a place that had already been exposed to immense truth, teaching, and evidence, and they had collectively chosen cynicism and rejection.
Oh, wow.
So by leading the man out, it's this silent but devastating critique. It's a physical demonstration that this environment has rendered itself unworthy of witnessing the light. The town had basically chosen its own blindness.
So he pulls the man out of the cynical environment, but the actual mechanism of the healing is what's so bizarre to modern ears. He spits on the man's eyes, places his hands on him, and asks, well, do you see anything?
Right.
And the man gives this incredibly vivid, strange response. He looks up and says, I see men, but I see them like walking trees.
It's fascinating because it is the only instance in this entire ancient record of a gradual staged healing.
Yeah, usually it's just, boom, you're healed.
Exactly. Usually a word is spoken and the restoration is absolute.
Oh.
But here, the healing stalls out halfway. The man is no longer in total darkness, but he certainly doesn't have clarity. His reality is completely distorted. Men look like trees.
Yeah.
Only after a second touch does he look intently and see clearly. And this isn't because the healer lacked the power to do it all at once. It's a deliberate, living illustration of how human enlightenment actually works.
When I try to picture that, the most visceral analogy is waking up in a pitch black room, like you've been asleep in the dark for hours.
Right.
Suddenly, someone throws open the door and flips on a massive industrial floodlight. You have eyes, the light is physically present, but you literally cannot see. The sudden introduction of light actually causes pain.
Yeah, you're blinded by the light.
Exactly. Your pupils are screaming, your brain can't process the visual data, and you're squinting at these massive, blurry, terrifying shapes. Your eyes require time, a biological process of adjustment to actually interpret the reality of the room.
That is precisely the mechanism at play here. When a person is first introduced to a radical new paradigm, like a totally new way of understanding themselves or the universe, they see indistinctly.
It takes time.
It does. The brain, the ego, the spirit, all of it needs time to recalibrate. The initial partial healing draws out the man's realization of his dependence on the source of that light. We expect instant gratification, but this event establishes a foundational rule for the rest of our deep dive today.
Which is?
That moral and spiritual clarity is a multi-stage process. You do not get the whole picture on day one.
And what's brilliant is how the text immediately bleeds this physical medical metaphor directly into a psychological reality in the very next scene.
The confession of Peter.
Exactly. They are walking toward the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and Jesus starts asking his closest followers, who do people say that I am? They throw out the popular rumors. John the Baptist reborn, Elijah, a prophet.
All the standard guesses.
Right. Then the question turns inwards. But who do you say that I am? And Peter, stepping up as the eager student, nails the answer. He says, "You are the Christ."
On the surface, that looks like a massive breakthrough. Peter has correctly identified the title. But if you hold this scene up to the light of the blind man at Bethsaida, the parallel is devastating.
That was so...
Peter is exactly like the man who sees men like walking trees. He has partial sight. He sees the who perfectly, but as the text immediately reveals, he's completely dangerously blind to the how.
Oh, because of his expectations.
Yes. His vision of what the Christ means is entirely distorted by his own cultural conditioning.
Right, because the second Peter gets the answer right, Jesus begins to explain the actual job description. He tells them openly, without any confusing parables, that he must suffer many things, that he's going to be violently rejected by the political and religious establishment, be killed, and rise after 3 days.
He lays out the brutal, unvarnished blueprint.
And Peter's reaction is to grab his leader, pull him aside, and begin to literally rebuke him.
Which, if you pause to think about it, is a breathtaking display of arrogance.
Yeah, I mean, you just called him the Christ.
Right. He is actively rebuking the person he just declared to be the ultimate divine authority. But you have to understand the historical framework Peter was trapped in.
The Roman occupation.
Exactly. For a first-century Jewish man living under the crushing, brutal occupation of the Roman Empire, the concept of the Messiah or the Christ was not some abstract spiritual concept.
No, it was political.
Deeply political. It was a militaristic expectation. They were waiting for a temporal king who would ride into Jerusalem, slaughter the Romans, restore the national sovereignty of Israel, and hand out positions of supreme power to his loyal followers.
So when Jesus says, "I'm going to suffer and be executed by the state," Peter's brain just short circuits.
Yeah.
It violates every definition of success he has ever been taught. His eyes haven't adjusted to the light. He is demanding that the universe give him the clean, binary outcome he was promised. We win, they lose, and I get a throne. The muddy waters of suffering, rejection, and death are entirely unacceptable to him.
Exactly. Peter savors the things of men: earthly safety, worldly credit, human policy. He is entirely consumed by his ego's definition of victory. And that is why the response he receives is so incredibly intense.
Yeah, Jesus turns around, looks at the rest of the disciples to ensure they all hear it, and says to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan, for you have in mind not the things of God, but the things of men." I mean, calling your best friend and lead disciple Satan seems like a massive escalation.
It is the harshest rebuke in the entire narrative. But we have to look at what the word Satan actually functions as here.
Okay.
In its original linguistic context, it means the adversary or the obstacle. Human wisdom, when it attempts to dictate the terms of divine plans based on self-preservation and comfort, acts as an ultimate adversary.
So Peter is the obstacle.
Yes. Peter, out of what he probably thought was well-meaning affection, was acting as a stumbling block. He was tempting his leader away from his ultimate necessary purpose just to maintain a comfortable illusion.
That translates so seamlessly to the modern condition. I mean, we may not be waiting for a political messiah to overthrow an ancient empire, but every single one of us operates with deep, unexamined paradigms of what the good life must look like.
Oh, absolutely.
Our definitions of success usually revolve around upward mobility, maximizing comfort, receiving public recognition, and, let's be honest, avoiding pain at all costs.
Right.
So when life or truth or a deeper spiritual calling demands that we suffer, when it demands that we sacrifice our carefully curated comfort for a higher purpose, our immediate visceral reaction is to play the role of Peter.
We rebuke reality.
Exactly. We say, no, that can't be right. I did the work. I followed the rules. There must be an easier way.
And this collision between the ego's desire for comfort and the reality of ultimate truth leads directly into what might be the most challenging philosophical statement in the ancient world.
Yeah, Jesus calls the entire crowd over.
Right, he refuses to keep this a private lesson for the elite. He issues a universal, radical redefinition of human flourishing. He says, whoever wants to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, and whoever will lose his life for my sake and the sake of the good news will save it.
You know, we have completely sanitized the concept of taking up your cross. Today, people use it to describe, like, having a micromanaging boss or dealing with a bad back or having a frustrating commute. Oh, it's just my cross to bear.
Right.
But to a first-century audience, that phrase wouldn't evoke a mild sigh of resignation. It would evoke absolute terror.
It was a chilling, violent metaphor. In the Roman world, the cross was not a piece of jewelry. It was the ultimate instrument of state-sponsored terrorism.
Yeah, it was meant to be public.
Exactly. It was designed to inflict maximum physical agony and total psychological humiliation. If you were carrying a crossbeam through a city, it meant your life was over. You had zero rights, zero future, zero autonomy. You were a dead man walking.
Wow.
To use that specific imagery as the prerequisite for following him is a complete and total renunciation of the ego as the ruling authority in your life.
He's essentially saying the path to ultimate reality requires the death of who you think you are. And then he follows it up with that famous economic question, for what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his life or forfeit his soul?
It's the ultimate bad trade on the cosmic stock market.
Right. You successfully acquire everything your ego ever demanded, the wealth, the status, the security, the whole world. But the cost of that acquisition was your core identity, your integrity, your actual capacity to experience life. You just become an empty shell guarding a pile of gold.
This is a thread you can find woven through the deepest levels of various wisdom traditions across human history, honestly. It's the profound understanding that the false self, the ego constructed by cultural expectations and survival instincts, must be shattered before the true self can breathe.
Yeah, ego death.
Exactly. True freedom is not the ability to do whatever you want. It is freedom from the tyranny of your own desires and fears. But what makes this specific text so potent is that it ties this universal necessity of ego death directly to the physical path of this one specific teacher. It's not just a philosophy. It's a person you are following to an execution site.
So if you are listening to this right now, the practical reflection is incredibly sharp. Look at your life and locate the areas where you are still seeing men like walking trees. Where is your understanding partial?
Right. Where are you fighting reality?
Exactly. Where are you fighting against the reality of your situation because it conflicts with your ego's demand for a clean, victorious outcome? You have to give yourself the grace to let your eyes adjust to the light, but you also have to ask the hard question. Are you rejecting truth simply because it comes with a cross you refuse to carry?
And just as the disciples are reeling from this horrific new data, trying to process the fact that their anticipated glory road is actually death march, the narrative completely shifts gears again.
Yeah, it's whiplash.
It is. To further stretch their capacity to understand, Jesus takes the inner circle, Peter, James, and John, from this dark valley of execution talks up to the highest, most blinding peak imaginable.
Right. It's the scene of the transfiguration. They hike up a high mountain, completely isolated from the crowds, and suddenly the physical reality of Jesus alters in front of their eyes. His clothing becomes glistening, radiantly white, and two of the most monumental figures in ancient Jewish history, Moses and Elijah, appear and begin speaking with him.
The symbolism here is dense and highly intentional. Moses represents the foundation of the law. Elijah represents the pinnacle of the prophets.
It's everything.
Yes. Their presence is a profound validation, signaling that the entirety of the ancient tradition culminates in this one person. The physical transformation, the radiating of divine glory, is meant to grant Peter, James, and John a fleeting glimpse of the ultimate reality they couldn't see when they were arguing about temporal kingdoms in the dust below.
It is the unvarnished light breaking through the physical veil.
Exactly.
It is the ultimate spiritual high, like the absolute peak experience. And Peter, who seems constitutionally incapable of sitting in silence, immediately tries to manage the situation.
Of course he does.
He is terrified, but he's also ecstatic. So he blurts out, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let's make 3 tents. One for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah."
It reveals a deeply ingrained human reflex. Peter experiences a moment of transcendent clarity and divine comfort, and his immediate instinct is to build infrastructure to contain it.
He wants to trap it.
He wants to set up camp. He wants to make the temporary transcendent moment a permanent residential address.
Yeah.
But in his desire to build these tents, he completely ignores the profound purpose of the mountain.
Which is what?
You do not climb the mountain to live there. You climb the mountain to gain the perspective and the power necessary to survive the valley.
Wow.
Private communion with the transcendent is absolutely necessary, but if it doesn't lead to public usefulness, it just becomes a form of spiritual narcissism.
I mean, we do this all the time, don't we? It's the retreat high. You go away for a weekend, you disconnect from your phone, you read a transformative book, you meditate, maybe you have an incredible breakthrough in therapy.
Yeah, you feel untouchable.
Right, you feel this intense, glowing clarity, and your immediate thought is, I'm never going back. I'm going to build a tent right here in this state of mind. I'm going to quit my job, move to the woods, and just hold on to this feeling. But then Monday morning arrives.
It always does.
The alarm clock goes off, the emails flood in, the kids start screaming.
The descent is inevitable. And the author of this text draws a jarring, almost violent contrast between the silent, glowing glory on the peak and the chaotic, agonizing reality waiting at the bottom.
The whiplash again.
Yes.
Yeah.
As soon as they hike down, the serenity shatters. They walk straight into a screaming crowd, scribes arguing with the remaining disciples, and at the dead center of the chaos is a desperate, exhausted father holding a violently afflicted child.
The crash back to reality is brutal. The father pushes through the crowd and explains the horror he lives with every day. His son has a mute spirit. It seizes the boy, throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth, grinds his teeth, and his body becomes rigid. And then the father delivers the line that exposes the impotence of the disciples. He says, "I asked your disciples to cast it out, and they weren't able." The contrast is devastating. Up on the mountain, total divine authority. Down in the valley, total human failure. Jesus expresses a profound lament over the faithless generation, and then the boy is brought forward. The moment the child is in the presence of Jesus, the affliction triggers a terrifying convulsion. Right, the boy falls, wallowing and foaming.
When Jesus asks how long this has been happening, the father says, from childhood. He describes how this destructive force has repeatedly thrown the boy into fire and into water, actively trying to destroy him.
It is the portrait of absolute parental despair. You can hear the exhaustion, the years of failed treatments, the sleepless nights, the sheer terror in the father's voice when he finally says, "If you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us."
And it's that if that Jesus immediately locks onto. He echoes the father's doubt back to him. He says, if you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes.
It sounds a little like victim blaming if you just read it quickly.
It can, but it is vital to understand that this demand for belief is not a magic incantation.
Yeah.
Nor is it Jesus saying his power is somehow limited by the man's psychology. It is a necessary diagnostic step.
How so?
It is about drawing out the man's internal posture. The ultimate obstacle in this valley wasn't the strength of the demonic affliction or the severity of the epilepsy. It was the weakness in the misalignment of human trust. Jesus is demanding that the man fully engage his agency.
And the father's response is, without exaggeration, one of the most raw, honest, and philosophically profound sentences ever recorded. He bursts into tears and cries out, "I believe! Help my unbelief!"
It really is the ultimate thesis statement of the human condition. We are not binary creatures. We do not exist in a state of pure, unadulterated faith, nor are we usually in a state of pure, absolute skepticism.
Right.
We are a paradox. We are simultaneously capable of profound trust and plagued by debilitating doubt. We hold both realities in our minds at the exact same time.
I think so many people feel intense shame about their doubt. They think that if they have questions or if they feel skeptical, it means their faith is broken or invalid. But this scene just shatters that expectation. This father is openly confessing his cognitive dissonance to the face of the divine, and he isn't reprimanded for it.
Not at all.
Jesus doesn't say, "Go home, work on your doubt, read a few books, and come back when you're at 100% certainty." He honors the tiny, fractured sliver of belief that exists amidst the massive, overwhelming doubt. He heals the boy, commanding the destructive spirit to leave and never return.
The mechanics of faith demonstrated here are crucial. True belief does not require the absence of doubt.
That's such a key point.
It is. True belief is the decision to act, to reach out, to move forward in spite of the doubt. It is acknowledging your total limitation, screaming, "Help my unbelief," while refusing to turn away from the source of healing. It is an active, desperate reliance, not a passive, serene certainty.
After the dust settles, they retreat into a house, away from the crowds. The disciples, who must be incredibly embarrassed by their public failure, ask Jesus privately, "Why couldn't we cast it out?" And Jesus gives them a very clinical answer. He says, "This kind can come out by nothing but by prayer and fasting."
It is a profound diagnosis of their internal state. The disciples had grown complacent.
Right. They thought they had leveled up.
Yes. They had been given authority earlier in the narrative, and they started treating it like a magic trick, like a skill they just inherently possessed. They assumed they could operate on autopilot.
Yeah.
But Jesus is explaining that confronting deep-rooted, long-standing destruction issues that have been entrenched since childhood requires more than casual effort. Prayer and fasting represent the intense, focused, self-denying discipline required to stay connected to the actual source of power. You cannot defeat profound darkness if you are untethered from the light.
And if we want to know exactly why they were untethered, why they were lacking that deep spiritual focus, the very next scene on the road exposes their internal distraction perfectly. It is a transition that is almost too absurd to be believed.
It really is.
Jesus pulls them aside privately, and for the second time, he explicitly predicts his murder. He says, "The Son of Man is being handed over to the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he is killed, on the third day, he will rise again." The text notes they still didn't understand, and they were too afraid to ask for clarification.
You would expect a heavy, mournful silence to fall over the group. I mean, their beloved leader has just told them, again, that a brutal execution is imminent. But their reaction exposes the absolute grip of the ego.
Yeah, they arrive in Capernaum, they get into a house, and Jesus asks them a simple question. "What were you arguing about on the way?" And the room goes dead silent. Nobody wants to answer. Because while Jesus was walking ahead of them, talking about his impending death, they had been dragging behind, getting into a heated argument about which one of them was the greatest.
The sheer tone deafness is staggering. It exposes just how deeply ingrained their worldly paradigms are. They are still anticipating that temporal political kingdom.
Even after everything.
Yes. They are literally jockeying for cabinet positions. They're arguing over who gets to be the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense, while the king they are supposedly following is trying to explain that his throne is going to be a Roman cross.
It's like your CEO sitting the team down, explaining that the company is facing catastrophic failure, that he is likely going to prison to save the employees, and your immediate response is to lean over to your coworker and say, "So, when he's gone, do I get the corner office or do you?"
That's exactly what it's like. It is breathtakingly narcissistic.
So Jesus has to intervene. He sits down, adopts the formal posture of a rabbi teaching, calls the 12 to him, and completely upends the entire human pyramid of power. He says, "If any man wants to be first, he shall be last of all and servant of all." And then he provides a devastating visual aid.
The child.
Right. He takes a little child, places the child right in the center of these grown men who are arguing about their status, takes the child in his arms, and says, "Whoever receives one such little child in my name receives me."
To really feel the weight of this, we have to strip away our modern romanticized view of childhood. Today, our culture revolves around children. We venerate them. But in the ancient world, what was the actual social standing of a child?
Oh, it was virtually non-existent, right?
Exactly. In antiquity, a child was at the absolute bottom of the social hierarchy. They had zero social capital, no legal power, no status, and crucially, no ability to repay a favor. They were dependents in the strictest sense.
So there's no networking value.
None. In a society governed by patronage and transactional relationships, where you only serve those above you to gain favor, or those below you who could offer you loyalty in return, a child offered nothing. To receive and serve a child was to expend energy on someone who could not advance your career.
Wow.
Jesus is taking an axe to the root of transactional ambition. He is saying true greatness is found in serving those who can do absolute nothing for your resume.
And immediately, John, one of the inner circle, tries to deflect. Maybe he feels convicted, or maybe he's just trying to reassert his authority. He interrupts and says, "Teacher, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we forbade him because he doesn't follow us."
It is a classic display of institutional tribalism. John is essentially saying, we found an unauthorized franchise and we shut it down.
Protect the brand.
Yes. The disciples were more concerned with maintaining their institutional monopoly than they were with the fact that demons were actually being cast out, suffering was being alleviated, and people were being healed. Their pride in being the in-group blinded them to the good being done.
Jesus immediately shuts that down. He says, don't forbid him. Whoever is not against us is on our side. The wisdom there is piercing. I mean, how often do we let our tribalism, our political affiliations, or our institutional pride blind us to the actual good being done in the world by people outside our specific group?
All the time.
But then, this correction from Jesus suddenly pivots into a terrifying, intense sequence of warnings. And I need to push back hard on this next part because, as a modern reader, it sounds completely unhinged.
Let's get into it.
Jesus starts talking about the danger of causing these little ones to stumble. And then he launches into the most visceral, horrific language imaginable. He says, if your hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. It is better for you to enter into life maimed rather than having your two hands to go into Gehenna, into the unquenchable fire.
Right.
Then he says, if your foot causes you to sin, cut it off. If your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. It's better to be half blind and crippled than to be thrown into hell, where their worm doesn't die and the fire is not quenched. And he ends by saying, for everyone will be salted with fire.
It's intense.
Listen, we need to stop for a second because this text just took a massive, horrifying left turn. We are talking about unquenchable fire, undying worms, hacking off your own limbs. I mean, this is the exact rhetoric that has been weaponized for centuries to terrorize people into religious submission. It sounds like a horror movie. How on earth do we extract wisdom from a passage that sounds like it was ripped from a medieval torture manual?
Your reaction is exactly why we have to examine the linguistic and geographical reality of the words he's using. If you strip this of its ancient context, it sounds like the raving of a sadistic deity. But you have to look at the landscape he is standing in and the rhetorical traditions he is utilizing.
Okay, walk us through it.
First, let's look at the word Gehenna, which we casually translate as hell. Gehenna was not an abstract, ethereal dimension of torture underneath the earth. It was a physical, geographical location you could walk to. It was the Valley of Hinnom, located just outside the walls of Jerusalem.
Wait, so it was an actual place. What actually happened in that valley?
Historically, centuries earlier, it had been the site of horrific idol worship, including child sacrifice.
Oh, wow.
Yes, it was a place of profound trauma. By the 1st century, it had been desecrated and turned into the municipal garbage dump for the city of Jerusalem.
A garbage dump.
A massive one. All the refuse, the rotting garbage, the bodies of dead animals, and the corpses of executed criminals who had no family to bury them were thrown into this valley. To keep the stench down and the disease from spreading, fires were kept burning there constantly, day and night.
Unquenchable fire.
Exactly. It was a literal place of perpetual fire. And where the fire didn't reach, maggots, the worms, consumed the rot.
Okay, so when he says where the worm doesn't die and the fire is not quenched, he isn't inventing a new cosmic torture chamber. He is pointing out the window to the local landfill. He's using the most repulsive, toxic image available in their everyday life to make a point.
Exactly. He is quoting the final line of the prophet Isaiah and applying it to the reality of moral decay. The imagery of the undying worm and the unquenchable fire is a profound metaphor for internal rot and external destruction. The worm represents the internal torment of conscience, the eternal regret of a life wasted on the ego, eating you from the inside out. The fire represents the absolute consuming destruction of moral corruption.
And the command to hack off your hands and feet, even as a metaphor, it's incredibly severe.
It is severe because the reality it addresses is severe. Jesus is using the medical reality of gangrene to explain the physics of the soul. In an era before antibiotics, if you got gangrene in your foot, it wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was a death sentence.
Right, there's no cure.
The corruption spreads. You don't negotiate with gangrene. You don't try to manage it or bandage it or medicate it mildly. You ruthlessly, agonizingly amputate the infected limb. Because if you don't lose the foot, you will lose your entire life. Jesus is saying that sin, the deep, corrupting egoism that destroys our humanity, is spiritual gangrene.
So the wisdom isn't about literal self-mutilation. It's about the absolute necessity of ruthless prioritization. You must amputate toxic habits, destructive ambitions, or corrupting relationships, no matter how deeply attached you are to them, before they rot your entire character.
Yes, and that brings us to the final cryptic phrase, everyone will be salted with fire.
What does that even mean?
Under the ancient Levitical law, every sacrifice offered on the altar had to be rubbed with salt before it was burned. Salt is a preservative. It purifies and prevents decay. Jesus is synthesizing these metaphors. He is saying that every human life will encounter fire. You have a choice. You can choose the purifying fire of self-denial now, the painful, salting discipline of cutting off your ego's demand, which preserves your soul. Or you can avoid the pain of discipline now, let the gangrene spread, and ultimately face the consuming fire of total moral collapse later. You choose your fire, the pain of discipline or the pain of destruction.
That is a staggering paradigm shift. It transforms a text used for fear-mongering into a brilliant, terrifying diagnosis of human behavior. And this abstract concept of amputating what we love is immediately dragged out of the realm of theory and put to the ultimate test.
Right, as we move into chapter 10.
Exactly. As the narrative presses forward into chapter 10, Jesus confronts the human ego in the two areas where we build our most heavily fortified safety nets, our intimate relationships and our bank accounts.
Let's examine the relational safety net first. The Pharisees approach him with a highly charged, politically and socially dangerous question, designed specifically as a trap. They ask, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?
Now, we need to be incredibly careful here. We are stepping into an arena that is heavily fraught, both in antiquity and today. Our goal is not to wade into modern political culture wars or dictate contemporary family law. Our goal is to analyze the philosophical stance the text is taking on human commitment.
And the philosophical stance is profound. The Pharisees cite the legal precedent of Moses, who permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and send his wife away.
Right.
Jesus acknowledges the law, but completely reinterprets its origin. He says, Moses wrote you this commandment because of the hardness of your hearts. He categorizes the permission of divorce not as the ideal standard, but as a tragic concession to human brokenness and cruelty.
Wow, okay.
Then he bypasses the legal code entirely and grounds his argument in the original design of creation. He quotes Genesis. God made them male and female, and the two will become one flesh. So they're no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate.
He is dismantling the idea that a relationship is a casual contract that can be voided when it's no longer convenient. He is elevating the marriage union to an indissoluble metaphysical reality. Two separate entities become one organism. You can't just separate them without tearing the organism apart.
This was revolutionary in a patriarchal society where women were often treated as disposable property, easily discarded if the husband found fault. But it is equally, if not more, countercultural today.
Oh, without a doubt.
We live in an era that holds individual autonomy as the highest possible good. The modern consensus is highly transactional. If a commitment, a job, or a marriage ceases to serve my personal self-actualization or my happiness, I have a moral obligation to end it.
The era of the conditional commitment.
Yes, but the philosophy of this text argues that treating relationships as disposable conditional commodities is the very definition of a hard heart. True unity, the merging of two lives, requires the exact opposite.
It requires vulnerability.
It requires a profound softening of the heart, an endless capacity for forgiveness, and, most importantly, the death of the autonomous ego we've been talking about. To become one flesh means you can no longer operate solely for your own benefit. It is another form of taking up the cross. It is the agonizing, beautiful work of sacrificing the me to preserve the we.
And speaking of people who refuse to sacrifice the me, this brings us to one of the most famous and frankly most heartbreaking encounters in the entire narrative. Jesus is heading out on the road again, and a man comes running up to him. He falls on his knees right in the dirt and asks, "Good teacher, what shall I do that I may inherit eternal life?"
Let's dissect the anatomy of this man's approach, because he defies all the stereotypes of the villains in this text. He is known as the rich young ruler. He possesses immense wealth and high social status. Yet he comes with desperation, he runs.
Yeah, dignity aside.
Right, he comes with profound humility, he kneels in public, he asks the ultimate correct question about eternal life, and he brings it to the exact right person. He is doing everything correctly.
Jesus answers by reciting the second half of the 10 Commandments, the ones dealing with human relationships. Don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't bear false witness, don't defraud, honor your parents. And the young ruler looks at him and says, "Teacher, I have observed all these things from my youth." And we have no reason to doubt him.
None at all.
He's not a hypocrite. He is a genuinely good, moral, disciplined person who has played by all the rules.
And that leads to the single most crucial, beautiful detail in the encounter. The text explicitly says Jesus, looking at him, loved him.
That changes the tone completely.
It does. The demand that is about to follow is not a punishment. It is not born out of spite for the rich or a desire to put an arrogant aristocrat in his place. It is an act of pure diagnostic love. Jesus looks at this moral, earnest man and sees the one invisible iron chain that is keeping him anchored to his ego. He sees the gangrene.
Jesus says to him, "One thing you lack, go sell whatever you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come follow me, taking up the cross."
And the reaction is devastating. The text says, the man's face fell, and he went away sorrowful, because he had great possessions. He came to the marketplace of eternal life. He asked for the price, and when he heard it, he decided it was simply too high.
His fatal flaw.
Exactly. His fatal flaw was that he desired the ultimate reality of heaven, but he refused to deal with the divine on the basis of absolute trust. His wealth was his actual God. He preferred the visible, tangible security of his bank account over the invisible, risky promise of following Jesus.
The psychological fortress of wealth is so powerful. We live in a society that practically venerates the accumulation of capital. And let's be honest about why wealth buys insulation.
Yes, it does.
It buys a buffer between you and the harsh realities of mortality. It buys the best health care. It buys security. It buys the ability to never have to rely on the generosity of a stranger. It creates a manufactured autonomy.
Exactly. Yeah. And that manufactured autonomy is precisely why Jesus turns to his disciples as the man walks away and delivers a terrifying verdict. He says how difficult it is for those who have riches to enter into God's kingdom.
Which shocks them.
Oh, they are absolutely astonished because they view wealth as a sign of divine blessing. So Jesus doubles down. Children, how hard it is for those who trust in riches to enter into God's kingdom. It is easier for a camel to go through a needle's eye than for a rich man to enter into God's kingdom.
I have to ask about this metaphor because I've heard sermons where people try to soften it. They say, well, there was a specific very low gate in the wall of Jerusalem called the Needle's Eye, and a camel could get through it, but it had to get down on its knees and have all its baggage stripped off. Is there any historical truth to that? It sounds like a convenient workaround.
It is entirely a convenient workaround. There is zero archaeological or historical evidence for a gate called the Needle's Eye in first century Jerusalem. That's a myth invented much later to make wealthy people feel better about the text.
Seriously?
Yes. Some linguistic scholars point out that the Greek word for camel kamelos is very close to the word for a thick ship's cable kamelos, which makes metaphorical sense, like trying to thread a massive rope through a sewing needle.
Yeah.
But whether it's a literal massive desert animal or a thick maritime rope, the theological point is exactly the same. Jesus is describing an absolute physical impossibility.
He's not saying it's difficult. He's saying it cannot be done. And the disciples understand the gravity of that immediately. They are exceedingly astonished, asking each other, then who can be saved? If the guy who has everything, including perfect morality, can't make it, what hope do we have?
Right.
And Jesus looks at them and delivers the core truth. With men, it is impossible, but not with God, for all things are possible with God.
The mechanism here is profound. Wealth creates the illusion of self-sufficiency. When you can buy your way out of any problem, you lose the capacity to fall to your knees and rely entirely on the divine. You lose the helpless, receptive posture of the little child that Jesus venerated earlier. The rich young ruler could not enter the kingdom because his hands were entirely full of his own resources. He had no capacity to receive anything as a pure gift.
It demands a really uncomfortable reflection for us today. Like, what is your great possession? For some, it is literal money. But for others, your great possession is your intellect. It's your carefully curated reputation.
Or your career.
Exactly, your career trajectory. It's the identity you've built as the person who always has it together. If the divine stood in front of you today and asked you to liquidate your ultimate earthly security, to trade your safety net for a life of profound, agonizing, self-sacrificing purpose, would you cast it aside, or would you walk away sad?
And just to prove how deeply entrenched this ego preservation is, look at how the disciples react. Peter immediately speaks up, operating out of a scarcity mindset, and says, "Behold, we have left all and have followed you."
He's keeping score.
He is. He's comparing himself to the rich man. He's saying, look, we passed the test. We gave up our fishing boats. We gave up everything. So what's our payout? What is the ROI on our sacrifice?
Jesus validates their sacrifice, thankfully. He assures them that anyone who leaves behind their safety nets will receive 100 times more in this present age: houses, brothers, sisters, mothers, children, lands. But he slides in one terrifying little caveat right at the end of the list. He says, with persecutions, and in the age to come, eternal life. He is confirming the reward, but guaranteeing the cross.
And the absolute climax of the disciples' blindness occurs right after this. For the third and final time, Jesus predicts his horrific suffering, detailing the mocking, the spitting, the scourging, and the execution in Jerusalem. He is laying out the ultimate reality of his servant leadership. And how do James and John, the two brothers who were on the mountain of transfiguration, respond?
It is borderline sociopathic. They walk up to him and say, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we will ask." That's already incredibly presumptuous. Jesus asks what they want, and they say, "Grant to us that we may sit one at your right hand and one at your left hand in your glory."
It is the ultimate naked grab for power. They are completely deaf to the reality of his impending torture. They are still operating entirely within the paradigm of a temporal political revolution, and they're trying to secure the positions of Prime Minister and Secretary of Defense before the other 10 disciples can claim them.
And Jesus looks at them and says, "You don't know what you were asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink and to be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" They confidently reply, "We are able."
They have absolutely no idea what they are signing up for.
None. They think the cup is a toast at a royal banquet.
The cup is an ancient prophetic metaphor for the wrath and judgment of God. The baptism is a metaphor for being entirely submerged in overwhelming suffering and death. They're blindly agreeing to be executed. And when the other 10 disciples hear about this backroom political maneuvering, they're absolutely furious.
Right. But not for the right reasons.
Exactly. Not because James and John were being unspiritual, but because the other 10 were furious that they didn't think to ask for the prime seats first. The entire group is infected with the gangrene of ambition.
So Jesus pulls them all together for one final, definitive re-education on the nature of reality. He says, "You know that they who are recognized as rulers over the nations lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. But whoever wants to become great among you shall be your servant, and whoever of you wants to become first among you shall be bondservant of all."
And then he brings it home.
Yeah, he delivers the ultimate thesis statement of his existence. "For the Son of Man also came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many."
He takes the pyramid of human power and completely inverts it. In the Roman world, and honestly in our corporate world today, leadership is about leverage. It is about coercion. It's about extracting maximum value from your subordinates to elevate yourself.
Yeah.
You measure your greatness by how many people serve you.
Right.
Jesus establishes a radically terrifying alternative: servant leadership. In this kingdom, authority is measured by how entirely you pour yourself out for the benefit of others. The ultimate leader is not the one who conquers, but the one who voluntarily acts as a ransom, a payment made in blood to liberate hostages who cannot free themselves.
It all comes down to what you are willing to let go of. I mean, the rich young ruler could not let go of his wealth. The disciples could not let go of their ambition and their desire for status. Everyone in this narrative is clinging so desperately to their cloaks of security. But as we reach the end of this deep dive, the author provides one final, explosive contrast. We meet a man who figures out exactly how to let go.
The narrative arc closes perfectly here. We began in chapter 8 with a blind man in Bethsaida whose healing was slow and partial, mirroring the disciples' confusion. We end here on the road out of Jericho with another blind man, but this time the dynamic is entirely different.
Jesus and a massive crowd are leaving Jericho, beginning the final steep ascent toward Jerusalem and the cross. Sitting in the dirt by the side of the road is a blind beggar named Bartimaeus. He hears the commotion, realizes it's Jesus of Nazareth passing by, and he begins to scream at the top of his lungs, "Jesus, you son of David, have mercy on me!"
Notice the profound theological clarity in his screaming. He doesn't just call him a teacher or a healer. He uses the messianic title, Son of David. And he doesn't demand his rights. He pleads for mercy.
He knows exactly what he needs.
Yes, he is physically blind, but his spiritual vision is already piercing straight through the darkness. He sees who Jesus actually is far more clearly than James and John do.
The crowd is embarrassed by him. They try to silence him. They rebuke him, telling him to shut up and know his place. He's a nuisance. But the crowd's rejection only fuels him. He screams even louder, "You son of David, have mercy on me!" And then, amidst the chaos of hundreds of people trampling up the road, the impossible happens. The text says, Jesus stood still.
Those 3 words carry immense weight. The entire momentum of the cosmic narrative is hurtling toward the execution in Jerusalem. The cross is looming. Yet the desperate, faith-filled cry of a completely marginalized, useless beggar possesses the power to stop the Son of God dead in his tracks.
It's beautiful.
It is. Jesus says, call him. The crowd's attitude instantly shifts. They say to Bartimaeus, cheer up, get up, he is calling you.
And this is the detail where all the themes we discussed today collide. Verse 50 says, he, casting away his cloak, sprang up and came to Jesus.
It is so easy to repass that as just a minor detail of movement, but in the ancient world, for a blind beggar, a cloak was not an accessory. It was his entire survival mechanism. It was his shelter from the brutal desert cold at night. It was his bed. During the day, he would spread it out across his lap to catch the copper coins people might throw at him. It was his bank account, his home, and his identity. It was all he had in the world.
Think about the devastating contrast. The rich young ruler had massive estates, endless wealth, and absolute social security. And when asked to part with it, he couldn't do it. He walked away consumed by sorrow.
Right.
Bartimaeus has nothing but a filthy, dust-covered piece of fabric. But the absolute second he is called by the truth, he rips it off and flings it aside without a single moment of hesitation. He throws away the only impediment that might slow his run to the light.
The rich young ruler trusted his riches. Bartimaeus abandoned his only physical security to trust entirely in Jesus. He fully embraced the terrifying, helpless posture of radical dependence that the rich man had tragically rejected.
It forces you to look at your own life and ask, well, what is my cloak? We all wear them. They are the coping mechanisms we build to survive our brokenness.
Yeah.
Sometimes to actually receive the cure, you have to violently throw away the very thing that has been keeping you comfortable in your misery.
Absolutely.
You have to cast away the excuse. You have to cast away the identity you've built around being a victim. You have to drop the safety net.
And when Bartimaeus reaches Jesus, he is asked the exact same question that was posed to James and John just a few verses earlier. What do you want me to do for you? James and John, in their blindness, asked for glory, power, and the best seats in the administration. Bartimaeus, operating in truth, simply says, Rabboni, that I may see again.
Jesus doesn't require a multi-stage healing this time. He says, go your way, your faith has made you well. And immediately, the man's sight is restored. But what he does with that sight is the final lesson. The text doesn't say he went back to Jericho to start a business or admire the architecture. It says he followed Jesus on the way.
And we know exactly where the way is leading. It is a straight, unavoidable road to the cross in Jerusalem. True sight is never just about acquiring philosophical understanding or finally getting your personal neuroses fixed. True sight demands action. Once Bartimaeus' eyes are open, he doesn't retreat into comfort. He uses his newly restored vision to walk the path of self-denial alongside his Savior.
So let's pull all of this together. We have traversed an immense, difficult landscape today. We started with the blind man at Bethsaida, exploring the painful, disorienting process of our eyes adjusting to a truth we don't fully understand. We watched Peter grasp the title of the Messiah, only to violently reject the agonizing reality of the cross.
We climbed the mountain of transfiguration and learned the danger of trying to build tents to hoard transcendent moments, only to plunge back into the valley of human suffering, where a desperate father taught us that true faith means crying out, "Help my unbelief," in the face of our deepest doubts.
We confronted the brutal medical reality of moral gangrene, realizing that we must ruthlessly amputate our pride, our toxic habits, and our institutional tribalism. We watched the tragedy of the rich young ruler who was too heavily armored by his wealth to slip through the needle's eye. And we witnessed James and John completely miss the point of servant leadership.
And finally, we ended in the dirt with Bartimaeus, the marginalized beggar who possessed the ultimate clarity to cast away his only physical security in order to sprint toward the light.
We began this deep dive by talking about diagnostic muddy waters and broken X-ray machines. This ancient text refuses to give us a clean, easy, comfortable diagnosis. It doesn't offer a 5-step plan for a happier weekend.
No, it really doesn't.
Instead, it exposes the gangrene of our ego. It exposes the hardness of our hearts when we treat relationships as disposable. It exposes our blind, desperate obsession with wealth, autonomy, and status. It turns the floodlights on in a pitch-black room, and it hurts. But it also offers the only actual cure. Radical self-denial, the willingness to embrace the posture of a helpless child, and the courage to cast aside the cloaks that keep us comfortable in our darkness.
That's the real challenge.
I want to leave you with this final, unavoidable thought to mull over. We spent this entire time dissecting what it actually takes to open your eyes. We've explored the cost, the struggle, the doubt, and the absolute surrender required to finally see the world as it is. But the real question is this. Once the blurriness fades and your eyes are finally open to the terrifying, beautiful truth of what actually matters, will you have the courage to follow where that truth leads? That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.